Opening. Visibility is usually treated as an advantage. To be seen often means to be recognized. To be noticed often means to be acknowledged. In many environments, visibility is assumed to be a step forward. People are encouraged to stand out, to speak up, to make their presence known. Being visible is associated with opportunity, growth, and security. But when we observe how power environments actually function over time, visibility begins to look more complicated. Being seen does not only attract attention, it also attracts interpretation. Once attention settles on a person, their actions stop being neutral. This episode examines how visibility changes the way behavior is read, judged, and remembered. Not because visibility is misused, and not because attention is hostile by nature, but because sustained attention alters how people respond. What begins as recognition often turns into exposure. Observation. In any structured environment, attention is unevenly distributed. Most people operate outside the center of focus. Their actions are noticed only when something goes wrong or when something unusual happens. This relative invisibility creates a kind of freedom. Small mistakes pass without comment. Silence is rarely questioned. Behavior is taken at face value. Visibility changes that condition. When a person becomes visible, attention settles. Others begin to notice patterns, tone, timing, and behavior that would otherwise pass without remark. This does not happen all at once. There is no clear moment when visibility turns into pressure. Instead, attention slowly accumulates. At first, visibility feels positive. Being seen can feel like validation. It can feel like inclusion or trust. The person may feel more engaged, more involved, or more relevant. But attention does not remain passive. Once a person is visible, their actions begin to carry more meaning than they intend. Ordinary behavior becomes interpretable. Choices are noticed. Hesitations are remembered. Visibility invites observation, and observation invites judgment. This judgment is not always negative. Often it begins as curiosity. People try to understand what the visible person represents, what their role is, what their position implies. Over time, this curiosity becomes evaluation. The visible person's behavior is no longer just behavior, it becomes information. A comment can be read as a signal, a pause can be read as intention, a mistake can be read as a pattern. Meanwhile, the same actions performed by less visible individuals pass without interpretation. This is the imbalance visibility creates. The visible person does not necessarily change how they act. What changes is how their actions are processed. As visibility increases, the margin for ambiguity decreases. Actions are less likely to be taken at face value. They are compared against expectations that grow over time. This is where visibility begins to narrow freedom. The more visible someone becomes, the less space they have to act casually. Their behavior is noticed not only for what it is, but for what it might suggest. This pressure does not require hostility. It emerges naturally from attention. People watch more closely what they believe matters. Often, visibility brings with it an assumption of control or influence. Even when none exists, others begin to imagine that the visible person has more awareness, more alignment, or more power than they actually do. This imagined influence reshapes interactions. People speak more carefully around visible individuals. They may wait before expressing disagreement. They may hold back information or seek confirmation before acting. None of this needs to be deliberate. It happens because attention changes how people manage risk. From the outside, visibility can look like advantage. From the inside, it can feel like constraint. The visible person becomes aware that their actions land differently now. They may sense that others are watching, even if nothing is said. Conversations feel more measured. Feedback feels more cautious. The environment grows quieter around them. This is not because the visible person has done something wrong. It is because attention changes behavior on all sides. Visibility removes anonymity, and anonymity, while often undervalued, provides space. Once that space is gone, behavior begins to stiffen. This is the early stage of visibility becoming a liability, not because attention is harmful in itself, but because sustained attention alters how meaning is assigned. Nothing dramatic needs to happen, no conflict, no confrontation, just continued visibility. When attention starts to stick. As visibility increases, responsibility often shifts in subtle ways. People begin to assume that the visible person is aware of more than they actually are. They assume access, alignment, or influence, even when none has been stated. This assumption changes how others behave around them. Questions that were once asked openly may now be asked indirectly or not at all. Decisions that were once shared may now pause, waiting for the visible person's reaction. The visible person becomes a reference point. This reference role is rarely assigned deliberately. It emerges from attention. When someone is noticed consistently, their presence begins to shape how others orient themselves. This can feel flattering at first. Being treated as relevant or central can feel like recognition. But it also carries weight. Once someone is treated as a reference point, their behavior is no longer just personal, it becomes contextual. Others begin to read it for cues. A neutral response may be interpreted as approval. A lack of response may be interpreted as disapproval. A delay may be interpreted as hesitation or strategy. The visible person may not intend any of these meanings, but intention matters less than interpretation. At this stage, visibility begins to pull responsibility toward the individual, even when formal authority has not changed. Others adjust their behavior as if the visible person carries influence. This creates a quiet imbalance. The visible person may feel that expectations are forming around them without ever being stated clearly. They may notice that others seem more careful, more reserved, or more reactive to their presence. This often produces confusion. The visible person may wonder why interactions feel different, even though their role has not officially changed. What has changed is not position, but perception. As perception shifts, tolerance narrows. Mistakes that would once have passed unnoticed now receive attention. Small inconsistencies are remembered. Patterns are inferred more quickly. Visibility reduces the benefit of doubt. This does not happen because people are unfair. It happens because attention creates comparison. Once someone is visible, they are measured against an internal image of what they represent. That image grows more defined over time. If the visible person deviates from it, even slightly, the deviation stands out. The action feels more significant than it would if performed by someone less noticed. Meanwhile, the visible person may feel that their freedom has quietly decreased. They may become more cautious, not because they want control, but because they sense interpretation. This self-monitoring is a common response to visibility. People adjust their behavior to reduce misreading. They speak more carefully. They hesitate longer. They choose neutrality more often. Ironically, these adjustments can increase scrutiny rather than reduce it. Careful behavior can look calculated. Silence can look intentional. Visibility creates a loop. Attention leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to adjustment. Adjustment leads to further interpretation. Over time, this loop becomes tiring. The visible person may feel exposed even when nothing is happening. They may feel that they are being watched without being addressed. This is where visibility stops feeling like recognition and starts feeling like pressure. Not pressure to perform better, but pressure to remain consistent. Consistency becomes safer than spontaneity. Predictability becomes safer than openness. At this point, visibility has changed the conditions of behavior. It has not created conflict. It has not created hostility. It has created constraint. Machiavellian lens. In environments of power, visibility has rarely been neutral. When Machiavelli observed courts and rulers, he paid close attention to who was seen, how often, and in what context. Visibility was not simply a sign of favor. It was a condition that shaped risk. In courtly life, being visible meant being counted. It meant that one's presence carried meaning beyond the immediate moment. Those who were regularly seen near power were assumed to be involved, aligned, or influential. whether or not that was true. Machiavelli noted that rulers watched closely those who appeared often in their presence. Familiarity created awareness, and awareness created caution. A figure who was constantly visible could not easily be ignored, but they also could not move freely. In these settings, visibility increased responsibility without always increasing authority. Those who were seen often were expected to embody loyalty, restraint, and consistency. Any deviation stood out sharply because attention was already focused on them. A single misstep could outweigh many quiet successes, not because it was severe, but because it was visible. At the same time, those who were less visible often enjoyed greater flexibility. Their actions were less scrutinized, their motives were less examined. They could change position more easily without attracting notice. Machiavelli observed that rulers were often more comfortable with distant supporters than with those who were constantly present. Distance preserved uncertainty. Visibility removed it. When someone became too visible, rulers began to ask different questions, not only what that person was doing, but how they were perceived by others. Visibility made perception a political factor. This created a paradox. To be seen was to matter, but to be seen too clearly was to invite control. Visible figures were expected to reflect authority, not complicate it. If their presence drew attention away from the ruler, even indirectly, it became a concern. Machiavelli described how attention could quietly shift from approval to monitoring. The visible individual might still be welcomed, but their behavior would be tracked more closely. They were no longer just present, they were observed. This observation did not imply distrust, it implied significance. But significance itself carried risk. In courtly power systems, visibility often narrowed options. The visible person could not act casually. They had to consider how each action might be interpreted by multiple observers at once. Invisibility allowed movement. Visibility required caution. This is how visibility began to function as a liability, not because being seen was wrong, but because being seen changed the conditions under which behavior occurred. Machiavelli did not frame this as injustice. He described it as a structural reality. Courts operated on perception, and perception was shaped by attention. Those who were most visible were often the most constrained. Modern framing. Greene. In modern environments, visibility plays a similar role, even when power structures look less formal. Organizations, public platforms, and professional hierarchies still respond strongly to attention. In The 48 Laws of Power, visibility is often treated as something that must be managed carefully. Not because attention is harmful by itself, but because sustained attention changes how people react. Greene describes settings where individuals who attract notice quickly lose the freedom they once had. Their actions become reference points. Their words are remembered. Their mistakes are replayed. The more visible someone becomes, the harder it is for them to remain ambiguous. In modern workplaces, visibility often comes through performance, communication, or access. Someone speaks up often. Someone is repeatedly acknowledged. Someone becomes associated with outcomes. At first, this can look like progress. Recognition brings opportunity. Opportunity brings exposure. But exposure brings interpretation. Greene's observations show that once someone is regularly noticed, others begin to assign meaning to their behavior beyond what is intended. Actions are no longer isolated. They are connected into narratives. A confident statement can be read as dominance. A careful pause can be read as calculation. A public success can be read as positioning. This narrative building happens even when no narrative is intended. Visibility also changes how errors are handled. A mistake made by a visible person feels heavier, not because it is worse, but because it disrupts an established image. People expect visible figures to be consistent. When they are not, attention sharpens. Greene often points out that attention rarely stays neutral. It turns into scrutiny. Once scrutiny appears, freedom narrows. Those who are less visible can experiment. They can adjust quietly. They can recover without explanation. Visible individuals are expected to account for themselves. In this framing, visibility acts like a magnifier. It enlarges both strengths and weaknesses, but it does not do so evenly. Weakness tends to stand out more sharply because it contradicts expectation. Another recurring observation is that visibility can create distance rather than connection. As someone becomes more noticed, others may grow more careful around them. Interactions become formal, spontaneity fades. People begin to manage impressions instead of speaking freely. The visible person may sense this shift without being able to name it. Conversations feel different, feedback feels filtered, relationships feel less direct. This is not hostility, it is adjustment. Greene's framing shows that visibility creates pressure not by intention, but by accumulation. Attention builds, interpretation follows, constraint emerges. At that point, visibility no longer functions as opportunity alone. It becomes something that must be navigated, not because it is dangerous, but because it changes the rules of interaction. Psychological mechanism. At a psychological level, visibility changes how people assess risk. Humans are not only attentive to behavior, they are attentive to patterns. When someone is repeatedly visible, the mind begins to track them more closely, even without conscious effort. This tracking serves a basic function. It helps people predict outcomes. Who matters, who influences decisions, who might shape the future. Visibility signals relevance. Once someone is perceived as relevant, their behavior stops being random in the eyes of others. It becomes information. The mind begins asking what actions mean, not just what they are. This is why visible individuals are often subject to interpretation rather than reaction. Instead of responding naturally, others pause, observe, and assess. Psychologically, attention narrows tolerance. When someone is closely watched, deviations stand out more clearly. The same behavior that would be ignored in others becomes noticeable. This does not require suspicion. It emerges from focus. Another factor is expectation. Visibility creates an internal model of who the person is supposed to be. Once that model exists, behavior is evaluated against it. Consistency feels reassuring. Inconsistency feels risky. The visible person may not be aware that such a model has formed, but others begin to rely on it to make sense of events. When actions align with expectation, nothing happens. When they do not, attention increases. This is why visibility often leads to pressure to perform predictably, rather than authentically. There is also a psychological shift in how responsibility is assigned. Visible individuals are often assumed to have more control than they actually do. Others may attribute outcomes to them, even when those outcomes are collective or situational. This attribution simplifies complexity. It gives people a focal point. Once a focal point exists, accountability concentrates. The visible person becomes associated with success and failure alike, regardless of actual influence. From the inside, this can feel unfair. From the outside, it feels efficient. Another response that appears around visibility is self-monitoring. People who sense they are being watched often adjust their behavior to reduce risk. They choose safer words. They avoid ambiguity. They become more careful. This caution is not strategic, it is protective. However, excessive caution can be misread. Careful behavior can look guarded. Neutral behavior can look intentional. The attempt to avoid interpretation can produce more of it. This creates a psychological loop. Visibility leads to attention. Attention leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to self-monitoring. Self-monitoring changes behavior. The cycle reinforces itself. Over time, this loop can drain energy. The visible person may feel constrained, even if no one is openly critical. The sense of being observed alters how freely they act. This is why visibility becomes a liability at the psychological level, not because people are hostile, but because attention changes how minds operate. The mind does not treat visible figures the same way it treats anonymous ones. Once attention settles, neutrality disappears. Closing observation. Visibility is often treated as a solution. When something matters, it is brought into view. When someone is important, they are noticed. Attention is assumed to clarify, but across power environments, visibility does something quieter. It changes how behavior is processed. Once attention settles on a person, their actions stop being interpreted in isolation. They are placed into context, compared against expectation, and remembered more clearly than those of others. This shift does not require authority. It does not require ambition. It does not require intention. It requires only sustained attention. The visible person becomes easier to read, but harder to understand. Familiarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is often where flexibility lives. As visibility increases, tolerance narrows. Actions that once passed unnoticed begin to feel significant. Silence becomes meaningful. Inconsistency becomes noticeable. The environment responds not with hostility, but with adjustment. People become more careful. Conversations grow more measured. Feedback becomes filtered. Responsibility drifts toward the visible person, even when formal roles remain unchanged. From the outside, visibility looks like influence. From the inside, it often feels like constraint. This is why visibility so often becomes a liability. Not because being seen is harmful, but because being seen changes how others calculate risk, expectation, and responsibility. The visible person loses anonymity, and with it, they lose space. They may still be included, they may still be trusted, but they are no longer neutral. Their behavior is read for meaning rather than accepted at face value. Nothing needs to go wrong for this to happen. No mistake, no conflict, no misuse of attention. Visibility alone is enough. Across courts, organizations, and public life, the same pattern repeats. Attention gathers, interpretation follows, freedom narrows. This does not make visibility a mistake. It makes it a condition that reshapes behavior quietly, gradually, and often without anyone deciding that it should. Once seen this way, visibility stops looking like a simple advantage. It becomes something that alters the environment around a person, whether they ask for it or not. The pattern is not dramatic, it does not announce itself, but it is consistent. And once noticed, it becomes easier to recognize when attention shifts, expectations form, and space begins to close. Until the next observation.